True story, I'm not supposed to be the speaker here. I was the JV squad. They called me from backup, and they said, hey, why don't you actually go and help out? So I'm on the B team. And when I got the schedule, it said something about the data play. I was like, oh boy, because Dr. Calendine, you brought it up earlier about data. You're like, hey, don't talk to me about data, talk to me about insights. That's exactly where my head is going. I was like, maybe I should just throw it all out. Maybe, Dr. Kurtz, as an example, maybe we should just get a little wild today and talk about blockchain or DAOs or ledger-based system and orthopedics. I'm not quite sure. And the reason that reaction came to me was a very real-world scenario. About 2 months ago, we had a big medical education event. And we had a doctor there, and we're talking to him, and one of the reps in the audience asked something about data. And he had a visceral reaction. And this is a hand on the Bible, true story. He's like, do not ever talk to me about data again. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of the discussion. You'll have to stop. It doesn't matter if it's Zimmer, Biomet, Stryker, the Pew. We all have to stop talking about data. The question is, so what? So what does it actually do? Is it going to drive efficiencies in my market? Is it going to reduce variability of care? Are we changing a patient experience? Are we leveraging it for insights? What does it ultimately matter? So my talk today is to give you a little bit of a window into how we're thinking about it from a Zimmer Biomet perspective. This looks like a very corporate slide because it is, and it shows a lot of our hardware, software assets. But our secret sauce, similar to what you just kind of heard with Tim, is an aggressive stance specifically around something for integration. All of these individual assets in isolation, they're just okay, but what if you can actually connect them in a meaningful way? I'll tell a quick story about ROSA. This isn't a robotic talk. You can go in there and check it out. But ROSA comes from a purchase called MedTech, which was out of Montpellier, France. And ROSA actually stands for Robotic Stereotactic Assistant. It was for a procedure called stereoelectroencephalography in the brain. They said, hey, look, it's a great chassis. Let's actually gut it and let's rebuild it from the ground up. And they rebuilt it with a hardware software developer's kit that allowed for this upgradable architecture. They said, hey, we can get data out of it really, really easy and get very explicit data and go put it somewhere. But here's the reality. It's just a spoke. It's not a hub. So you got to have a hub. Ultimately, that's where My Mobility comes in. And I hope everyone in this audience, if our reps have done anything right, I hope you've at least heard of it. So My Mobility is a care management system, supports and guides patients through an episode of care. But there's 2 levels to it. Level 1 is what most people categorize as a patient engagement tool. And the reality is, these are a dime a dozen these days. I can't throw a rock. I can't wake up on Sunday morning and open up LinkedIn without seeing a new patient engagement tool. And you probably had everybody talking to you all about them. And they all have some core ingredients. Preoperative and postoperative education, messaging, asynchronous, synchronous, self-directed video exercises. We're all talking prompts, all in there. We are taking a different stance relative to data. Some people even get a little confused about what the heck's going on with this Apple Watch. It does 2 things. First, great compliance tool. If anyone wears one, you know those little rings on there, okay? The second thing, though, is it captures 20 different data metrics around how much and how well people move. So we're starting to visualize movement. Now, it's just a wearable. It's just one wearable. There's a lot of things that ultimately we can look at. Now, you start getting a little bit deeper here, and it starts to go into that level 2. What are we trying to accomplish with this? What if we can objectify the episode of care before, during, and after surgery to better understand things like quality? Now, it's not going to happen overnight. This is a process that takes an enormous amount of data, an enormous amount of time. We've been on the market for 3.5 years. I think as of this morning, I counted 2.8 million logins overall. So we're starting to get a decent amount of data. But the story goes, if you have someone here, Steve Cooper, or we'll take Jacob Marshall here, that's a shoulder procedure. But you can say, what's the baseline of how much and how well someone is moving? We'll call it 2 weeks before surgery. In the space of the hip, we could look at, what a preoperative plan for pelvic tilt would ultimately look like, and then ultimately what was the execution of that intraoperatively, memorialize that within the system. 2 weeks post-op, what's going on? Are they sleeping on the couch? Are they doing hot laps around the track? We're starting to quantify that care over scale and to start to better understand things. Now, the question that Dr. Cal and I may have when he walks up to me at a AAOS is like, look, I cannot afford for this to impact my staff 1 minute. 1 minute, we can't afford that right now. Those are the gaps as an industry that keep me up at night. How do we solve for that? We have to innovate. We have to think forward. Does it make sense for us to start creating cost centers or create other centers where we can get mid-levels to offset people monitoring these services? These are some of the innovative aspects that we're looking at right now. So at a glance, tons of data, and this can scare someone. But in an ideal state, you want to be able to have your nurse, not you, I hope no surgeon ever looks at this unless they really need to, check it at the end of the day, maybe 1 time a day. And maybe they can look at an outlier. And if you visualize a scatter plot, maybe you have that outlier that could be a readmission, an ED visit, a MUA for knee, something else going on that could impact experience or anxiety. So we're starting to layer in that second level again, a sophistication to the data. So this is all the different data points that we can collect right now to create what we call our AI factory. By the way, it's a terrible name. Our AI factory is our proprietary algorithm that we have built that allows us to drop different AI products into. We have 180,000 patient days that are currently logged. Now, it has to go through a washing machine is what we call it, and get really good, clean output. And our first product that we launched at AAOS, I don't know if anyone saw us wearing those ugly blue Smurf suits. Everyone was like, Walk AI, this is the product. But it's looking at days 15 to 40 and saying, hey, are they on track or off track for days 90? It's kind of cool, not super cool, but kind of cool. But if something's going on, it'll put them in an outlier if you're in the bottom 15% of a cohort that's ultimately identified. Now, interestingly enough, because it's not a rules engine, if you think about a rules engine, what is a rules engine? A rules engine is like a decision tree process that starts splintering down. But if you actually use Python for machine learning, you can dynamically interact with it, and it changes on a dime. So you start to see things like 92% confidence that would change every single day as they walk through days 15 through 40. Now, this is our first product. We have 4 products that are on the horizon specifically around AI. And again, it sounds complex, and there was a lot of stuff we just threw out there. But the mission's very simple. Can I make someone's life easier? Can I actually go out and find that readmission or someone that may not be on track? I talked about another bucket that's important is, can we radically change the patient experience? Can we start to leverage this? If you think about tonal, if you think about Orange Theory is kind of an interesting one actually for me, because someone that's doing fitness, they say, hey, here's an orange band. If you live in this orange band during your fitness routine, that's going to optimize that experience. What if we can do that from an orthopedic standpoint? What if we can start to leverage this to interact and engage differently? I got to be very honest. I was sitting there back listening to Tim's talk, and we were talking about economics. And in my head, I was like, holy crap, this is a great discussion. I kind of want to throw my discussion out the window and just continue talking about economics. That needs to be nurtured more than just a 15-minute discussion. Because how do we ultimately create value around this is so important. Because we're going to have to innovate. As innovative as this is, we're going to have to innovate equally from an economic standpoint to make it all make sense. Now, the smart knee, we saw this flashed up here earlier. I'll just give you a couple of thoughts on it. And I know it's a knee and this is an anterior hip meeting, but just imagine where this is going. So what's so unique about this is the 100% compliance around this. It's objective, it's in vivo. You can't leave your phone on the desk. You're not recharging your watch. Right now, again, another data point from this morning, we have logged 15 million steps since we have launched this product. And it is so early on. The amount of data ultimately that's coming off is remarkable. We were talking to a patient the other day. The patient said, it's so cool to actually see my recovery being able to go up. But what if there was a drop? What if the care team saw something that changed? You know, because of that compliance, maybe that's a smoke alarm and we need to go pay attention to it. Now, the mechanics of it are relatively simple. You have a 3D accelerometer, a 3D gyroscope, you have a short-range antenna. All of this goes to a base station, goes to the cloud, goes back to my mobility, ultimately to get digested, pushed out into the world, interact both with the patient as well as that care team member. And we've got a lot of interesting data standpoints. I won't go through all of this, but it's things like functional and tibial range of motion, step count, stride length, cadence, et cetera. But there's going to be more coming. Because if you think about what an actual 3D accelerometer and gyroscope do, you have things like pitch, you've got yaw, you've got roll. You put those together and there's some really interesting things, and you start measuring frequency. What can we start to learn? What could that eventually do in the space of hip or in the space of shoulder? There's a lot. A lot's been talked today on mixed reality, and I'll just give you my 2 cents on it for whatever that's worth. I've been a little bit of a skeptic in this space as someone who's very, very pro-tech. We've evaluated a ton of companies. We've done remarkable diligence in it. And it's just, is the time right? Are we here? I mean, are we to a point where it's adding substantive value in the market? And we said no to a lot of companies. We did strike a deal with Microsoft that's proprietary on both a hardware and software aspect. We have a couple homegrown software pieces here, things like instrument assembly, surgical demo, we have skeletal tracking. We have a team of 12 right now that's integrating ROSA. We're in the FDA submission process, anticipate August, we'll have our integration with ROSA all wrapped up, and there's a couple versions coming after that. But then you hear things about like Dr. Murphy talking about, hip insights and what they're doing at SPA, and it's really inspiring to say, hey, what other partnerships could we do out there, again, in the spirit of ultimately adding value? This is something that Tim talked about as well, and I think all companies, whether it's J&J or Zimmer Biomet or Stryker, have to be very sensitive of. Is ultimately, how do we treat this data? Privacy is a hot, hot topic. So our intent is to allow for that transparency, that flexibility, for everybody to know who owns the data, who does not own the data, what's de-identified, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to be very forward-thinking in that. So I'll end with this on mine. At the beginning, we were talking about that question of ultimately who cares. My call to action for this group is if anyone ever talks to you about data, ask that question, who cares? And I hope that they say something good. So, thank you.
Awesome.